Shalom. Shalom is the Hebrew word for peace, but it's not meant to be the peace which is simply the absence of tension. It's the peace that is the presence of justice. It's an important theme in Jewish tradition, and it's also an important theme in the Unitarian Universalist Church tradition. Today, I'm talking about some of the spiritual themes in Unitarian Universalism. And this day, I'm focusing on wisdom that we draw from the Jewish tradition. My friend Barry Whittemore, who's a Unitarian Universalist minister, often says that Unitarian Universalism is a 2,000-year-old Jewish reform movement. And he has a point. There is a sense that it's a part of a continuing reformation of the Jewish tradition. So one of the important themes in Judaism that we draw from in the Unitarian Universalist tradition can be captured by a story that is told about Rabbi Hillel. One day a man walked up to Rabbi Hillel and said, "Explain to me the Torah," the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. He says, "Explain to me the Torah while I stand on one foot." And Rabbi Hillel says, "Do not do to others what you would not want them to do to you. This is the Torah. All the rest is commentary." So in Unitarian Universalism and in Judaism, there's a focus on how we treat each other as the most important thing. Don't get so caught up in the commentary that we miss the main point, which is how do we treat each other. Now, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Torah, many people are surprised to learn, especially in the South and the Bible Belt, are surprised to learn that these 5 books make no reference to heaven or hell or life after death. That is not the point of these books. The theme, though, there is a theme on salvation. Salvation is an important theme, even when there is no emphasis on life after death. And in the Torah, the theme of salvation is about moving from slavery in Egypt to a promised land where everyone can be free. It's about deliverance from oppression. And in the Unitarian Universalist Church, we share this emphasis on a sense of this worldly salvation. When we feed the hungry, that's salvation from hunger. When we tutor kids, well, education is salvation from ignorance. When we house the homeless, that's salvation from the elements. This sense that the work we do to make the world a better place is the work of salvation. That's an important theme. It's the most important thing, because one of the things that we draw wisdom from is the prophetic tradition. And the prophet Amos would say that the important thing is not doing the right rituals or the right ceremonies or participating in the right religious gatherings. The most important thing is to treat each other well. Prophet Amos says, "Away with the noise of your songs, your assemblies stink. I hate your rituals, but let justice roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." So the emphasis is not on right ceremony, but right living, right action in the world. The prophet Isaiah would focus that it's not about personal piety, doing the right thing, personal morality, personal piety. But one of the things Isaiah says is the fasting that is needed is to lift every yoke, to release the oppressed, to undo heavy burdens. So this anti-oppression work is at the heart of spirituality. And this is an important part of Jewish tradition, and it's an important part of the Unitarian Universalist tradition. Now, there's another aspect of both our traditions that's captured in this story. The story is told of a rabbi who was serving a new congregation, and it got to the point in the service where people would say the words, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one." And what happened during this part of the service is some of the members of the congregation would stand up and some would remain seated, and then they would get into a big argument about what is the most appropriate way to behave in the synagogue, and the rabbi got very frustrated. And he did something that rabbis often do. They went and found the oldest member of the synagogue to find out what the tradition was. And he goes to the nursing home where the elder is, and he says to the elder, "Can you tell me what's the tradition in our synagogue? Is it the tradition to stand when we say those words?" And the elder said, "That's not the tradition." And he said, "Well, is the tradition to sit while we say those words?" And the elder thinks about it and says, "No, that's not the tradition either." He says, "Well, you got to tell me something, because right now half the congregation stands and half the congregation sits, and then everybody gets into a big argument." And the elder says, "That's the tradition." So in the Unitarian Universalist Church and in the Jewish tradition, there's room for disagreements. There's room for different points of view. There's room for even some arguments about what the tradition is. The story of creation in Genesis, there's two different stories of creation, one in Genesis 1 and one in Genesis 2. So I have two different and contradictory stories about how the world was created. Well, these are wisdom stories. They're not science. They're wisdom stories, and they're to teach us who we are, why we're here, what is our purpose. They're to teach us something about what it means to be a human being. And so wisdom traditions, sometimes they're different points of view. And so both our traditions welcome different points of view. So there's another part of the tradition. Unitarian Universalism comes out of the wisdom tradition in Judaism. There is a wisdom tradition in many other traditions as well, but in the wisdom tradition, it doesn't matter whether a teaching is Jewish or whether it belongs in the Torah. The most important thing in a wisdom tradition is it wisdom? Is it wise? Is it a helpful thing to believe? And we see the wisdom tradition at work in the book of Proverbs, because in the book of Proverbs, many people think that's a collection of Jewish sayings. But it's not. It's a collection of Jewish and from different cultures all around the Mediterranean area. Just that whole area, drawing wisdom from many different cultures and many different religions and assembling it into one book, the book of Proverbs. Now, it reminds me of something that Ralph Waldo Emerson said, who was a Unitarian minister at one point in his life. He said that we should all create our own Bibles. And essentially, that's what the book of Proverbs is drawing wisdom from many different traditions and assembling it in one book. And that's something we can all do. We belong to the wisdom tradition. Another thing that we have in common with Judaism is this idea of the continual need to practice forgiveness. Now, in the Jewish tradition, a lot of this centers around the New Year in Jewish tradition, the Day of Atonement. And one of the spiritual themes there is that when you've done something wrong to someone, you don't go to God to ask for forgiveness. You go to that person to ask for forgiveness, thus eliminating the middleman. So the emphasis on forgiveness is going directly to people and asking for forgiveness and granting forgiveness when someone comes and approaches us and asks for forgiveness. Now, this is the most important way to practice forgiveness, eliminating the divine middleman, as it were. But it's only, there are exceptions when making a direct appeal for forgiveness might do more harm than good, then that's not the way to go. But otherwise, direct appeal to people, a direct relationship with each other. It's that sense of reciprocity. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you have to do unto you. It's about reciprocity. Another theme in Judaism and in Unitarian Universalism is sometimes belonging is more important than believing. A story is told about an atheist who used to go to the synagogue every Sabbath. And people wondered why he went to the synagogue every Sabbath, even though he wasn't a believer. And finally, someone asked him, and he said, "Well, my friend Morty goes to the synagogue to be with God, and I go to the synagogue to be with Morty." So there is a sense that belonging doesn't necessarily mean believing. You might be an atheist and be Jewish. You might be a believer and be Jewish. You might be grounded in sacred tradition, or you might be grounded in a more secular way of looking at the world. You may be filled with faith or filled with doubt, but you can still belong. And that's true in the Unitarian Universalist Church. We can have these very different orientations and still belong, still be a part of the faith tradition. So in the statement of 6 sources of Unitarian Universalism, one of them is one of our sources is said to be Jewish and Christian teachings which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. So today we've been talking about the Jewish tradition. In the next lesson we'll talk about what we draw from the liberal Christian tradition. But one of the things both share is the desire to keep it simple. Love your neighbor as yourself. Keep it simple. It's not so important to have the right rituals, the right sacrifices, or the right ceremonies. As the prophet Micah said, this is not the most important thing, these rituals and these ceremonies. The most important thing is to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And one of the ways we walk humbly is by being open to different points of view, being open to debate, disagreement, and discussion, while still living in peace. So I say to you, Shalom.